Rolling. All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions have been canceled or been put on hold for a bit, I figured I would bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin Rollercoaster, intriguing interviews with creative minds. With us tonight is Will Murray, the acclaimed author of more than 75 books and novels about pulp adventures, including Doc Savage, Tarzan, King Kong, The Shadow, Sherlock Holmes, and more. Hello, Will.
Hi, Russ. Thank you for inviting me. This looks like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're gonna have a good time. Again, just a heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for Will in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, so we're just gonna jump right in. So, Will, tell me. So, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
Boston, Massachusetts. Largely grew up in Boston and then moved to Quincy, Massachusetts, which is near Boston. So, and this is the 1950s and 60s we're talking about. So, I grew up in a diet of DC and Marvel comics, and then graduating to Nancy Drew mysteries, and then TV novelizations, and finally Edgar Rice Burroughs and Doc Savage, which created my interest in pulp magazines.
Wow, you just answered like 6 questions in a row. So
no idea.
Hold on. So let's go back a second. So when you were growing up, was it just you? Did you have brothers, sisters?
I had a brother and a sister.
So were they were they sort of your partners in fictional crime too? Or were you was that just your thing?
My brother read my comics. I bought the comics and he helped me read them. My sister read her own comics, Archie, Casper, and I read some of those too. So I would say we all read comics, but I think I was I was the oldest, and therefore I was the kingpin of that stuff.
So at the time, were your parents did they encourage it, support it? Did they just tolerate it? What was their experience? What was that like?
They put up with it. I think when I started reading comics, my grades started to shoot up, and they may have made a correlation. But, I have vivid memories of my father buying a new couch, and the cushions didn't fit quite properly. So we took my copy of The Incredible Hulk #1 and Fantastic Four #4, rolled them up and shoved them between the cushions so they would sit properly.
Oh, no. Oh,
yeah.
Oh, what a heartbreak. Oh, yeah. Did you give him what's what about that?
Well, I was too little.
Did you ever tell him?
No, I never brought it up. It was, it was a long time later that they began to accumulate value, and I was buying with his money, the allowance he gave me. So it's like, well, besides then, those weren't the ones I was saving. It was the DCs. I was stupidly saving the DCs and not saving the Marvels, but that later changed.
So when you first got into, at the time, so was comics, that kind of thing, was that, were you a loner like that? Did you have a bunch of friends? Like, what was it like back then?
I did have a few friends who read comics, but as I got a little bit older, grade by grade, I think I knew fewer people who were into it, and they weren't into it the way I was. I was a collector. I would buy them religiously and not want to miss issues. Other kids I knew would buy them sporadically and read them for just escape and not necessarily keep them. So I did have a few friends who and I acquired at least one collection when he outgrew comics. But, it was a different world then. So more kids read comics, but it didn't have the same resonance it does now.
So what was it like for you? So back then, so what was the appeal to you of, you started off in comics and it evolved from there? What drew you into comics in particular? Whereas for other kids, it was just kind of like something they did and they let it go.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. All I know is once I started getting allowance and I could read with comprehension, which was sometime in the middle of the 3rd grade, I started buying them. And once I started buying them, it was Christmas vacation, 1961. I bought my first bunch of comics, which was probably with Christmas money. I don't remember what prompted me, but suddenly I was just buying them every week.
So what was the title or the titles that resonated for you the most?
In the beginning, I'd buy all the DC books that were superheroes. And I remember Superman and Strange Adventures were some of the earliest, literally the first ones I purchased. And then I would buy the Marvels on the side. And maybe something else here and there if I had the extra money. But the DCs and the Marvels are the ones that grabbed me. But the DCs were the ones I collected. Marvels, we used to do a thing when we were kids, cutouts. We'd take the comics and cut the figures out and put them in a box to play with. And the Marvels got cut up and the DCs didn't. Big mistake.
Well, who knew? Who knew?
Who knew?
So, all right. So you started with comics. Then you mentioned you got into some Nancy Drew.
Yeah, but at the same time I was reading comics, I was in a grammar school where they had a reading program, and they brought in a set of Nancy Drews and a set of Hardy Boys and let us take one home, every week or so. And I guess I didn't care for any books with boys in them in terms of, kids. I wanted to read more about adults. So I picked Nancy Drew and I liked those. And that led me ultimately to Doc Savage and other things, because the editions I read were the older editions with the old 1930s, 1940s cars and suits and word choices.
So let's talk about Doc Savage for a little bit. He's a character that, I would say probably most modern readers are not that, especially the younger generations, are not familiar with Doc Savage. What was the appeal of Doc Savage then and now?
I think the appeal of Doc Savage is the same appeal of Superman, Batman, and many characters like that. The superhero. Doc was a magazine character, but not a comic book character originally. But when I discovered Doc Savage, I was still reading Marvel Comics, and Doc Savage was kind of like book versions of Marvel superheroes without necessarily the powers, but with the great villains and the high adventure and the super scientific menaces. And it was just a continuation of the stuff I liked at Marvel, just a different format. And of course, Superman was inspired by Doc, as was Batman, as was Fantastic Four, Challenges the Unknown, Mr. Spock and Star Trek, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Buckaroo Banzai. So who knows what would come out next that's influenced by Doc Savage. So he's a character that's radiated from his 1933 origins to the 21st century. And I'm proud to still be continuing his adventures in book form.
And, but what particular, so it's something that you just touched on, the fact that Doc didn't have powers. So, yeah. That's sort of, kind of, Batman is like that, right? Batman does lots of stuff, but has no powers. Is that what do you think, the fact that he had no powers, but was still kind of going on these big swashbuckling adventures? Was that?
Well, I think what it was is he was a proto-superhero. He was a Superman. He was stronger and smarter than anybody, had more money than anybody, and had more scientific and other skills. And so he was the last step before Superman in terms of the evolution of the popular hero. He was called a superhero by his publisher. So all he needed was a costume and a few more amps of wattage, and he could have been the first superhero in the modern sense.
Right. So you were an avid reader of these, various pulp and superhero adventures. What was the transition for you onto the writing side of things?
Well, I got into Doc Savage so heavily, I started buying the pulps. And when I started buying the pulps that hadn't been reprinted, the Doc Savage novels from the 1940s hadn't been reprinted, I saw a whole different Doc Savage, and I began writing about it for fanzines. One thing led to another. I was asked to contribute to a book on Doc Savage, the man behind Doc Savage. It's a book on Lester Dent, his creator, and Doc Savage. And then, it's hard to remember it in an ABC kind of way, but I came into touch with Norma Dent, who was Lester Dent's widow. I became her literary agent. I marketed to Bantam Books an unpublished Doc Savage novel he'd written. And then I found an outline he'd produced that was rejected from 1934, and I got permission to turn that into a novel, and I submitted to Bantam Books, and 12 years later they decided to publish it when they ran out of original novels. And that was basically how I became a novelist.
So you started there, and you've certainly written quite a bit from there. So tell me about the evolution from, you started off in Doc Savage, that kind of really kicked it off. Did you study to be a writer? Did you just sort of do it on your own?
I took creative writing in college, but those classes were a joke. I was already being published when I was in college. I was writing for encyclopedias, so I don't think those classes helped me very much. I kind of blew them off. I left out a big point. Before my Doc Savage first novel, which was my Doc Savage novel, Python Isle, before that was published, I was asked to write a nonfiction book on the Destroyer paperback series, which later became a movie, Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins.
Which I just watched the other day.
Yeah, and that used to be a big UHF movie. Now it's a cable and whatever movie. But I was asked to ghost a Destroyer novel, which I did in 1982, and that was published in 1984. And one thing led to another. I ended up writing 40 Destroyer novels over a 10 or 12-year period of time. That's where my novel writing career really took off. And my first novel, Python Isle, was published actually sort of in the middle of all those Destroyers.
And the Destroyers were, for those of the folks out there who haven't read them, tell them about the Destroyers.
Destroyer was a story of Remo Williams, a cop who's executed for a crime he didn't commit, but then he wasn't really executed. He was impressed in the old seamanship sense of it into a secret organization called Cure, and trained in a super martial art called Sinanju by a Korean gentleman who was 80 years old and a vicious killer, as you could imagine. And he became an assassin for the U.S. government. As the series progressed, it became like Doc Savage, increasingly tongue-in-cheek, increasingly concerned with fantasy and science fiction, as well as espionage and action and all that stuff. I ended up writing the spiritual descendant of Doc Savage in the sense that it was about yet another Superman,
right?
Who had high adventures, who would tackle supervillains of the comic book type as well as ordinary villains. And so I was very fortunate. Between writing Doc and the Destroyer, I wrote two of the greatest action adventure series of two entirely different generations.
So, which must have been just a blast. But you've done more than just that. You've written for comic books, nonfiction, magazines. So, what about the comic book side of things? What's been your path?
That started through the Destroyer again. Warren Murphy, one of the creators of the Destroyer, sold the rights to the series to Marvel Comics around 1987, I think it was, and suggested I write the series because I was writing the novels. And Marvel gave me a shot, and I wrote the first Destroyer series, which is a black and white comic, double size. I wrote that every month for the less than a year it ran. Then I wrote some of the color ones. Warren wrote some of them. And during the course of that, they asked me to write a fill-in story for Iron Man. And in the course of that, I created the unbeatable Squirrel Girl, who's now kind of a famous cultural icon and female empowerment character. But back then, she was kind of a lark and kind of fun and not necessarily to be taken entirely seriously. So
you've done so much work across some of these iconic characters. You've written in various forms about Tarzan and others, King Kong. And so, I have to ask, 'cause my mom was she always loved Tarzan. How did you get into Tarzan? How did that happen?
Edgar Rice Burroughs was the first pulp writer I ever read, and I read his John Carter of Mars books. And when they started to peter out, I broke down and I bought my first Tarzan, reluctantly, because like many people, I sort of thought Tarzan was kind of like Johnny Weissmuller movies. But when I read the first book, it was a real novel, and the character was really compelling, and he wasn't anything like me, Tarzan, you, Jane, Tarzan of the films. And he was just another pulp character that I thought was unique, interesting, and on a level that was approaching that of the superhero without necessarily wearing a costume.
So talk to me about, and I have to ask, and I promised that I would, talk to me about The Shadow. I remember my mom used to play them for me, and I've got some friends who they promised that I would ask.
Back in the early 60s, The Shadow was revived in the first of the old-time radio shows that was rerun as an experiment. I think this is around 1963. And when they came on the air, I was electrified. I'd never heard of anything like this. And there was a Shadow comic published at the time. It wasn't that good, but they were Shadow paperbacks. They were modernized, and I read a few of those, and I liked them. Then they started reprinting the original pulp novels, and I liked them even more. Eventually, I became friends with Walter Gibson, who created the Shadow and wrote most of the novels, and ended up writing a book about the Shadow, which we'll probably bring out again sooner than later in a new edition. I think the Shadow is one of the great, again, proto superheroes. He had a cloak. He inspired Batman just as Doc Savage did, but in a different sense. Batman is sort of a combination of Doc Savage, Zorro, the Shadow, and a few other characters. And he was just a great character. And, that radio show ran forever. And the novels, there were like 325 of them. It was an extremely popular character.
I had no idea.
During the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s. And then he disappeared. And like I said, in the 60s, he was revived, and he's not left us since.
So what is it do you think about, so for example, if we start back even with the Shadow and Doc Savage and through Batman, what if there's a through line, right, for the type of sort of, hero or anti-hero they are? What's that compelling quality that you keep coming back to, that we what attracts us to that type of character?
Well, we're always interested in heroes, even if they're a little tainted. People who are larger than life, people who can, walk into a room and take on 5 guys and defeat them if they're bad guys, or even if they're good guys. We all want to be more powerful, more astute, more intelligent, more capable than we are. And vicariously, we live that through these kind of characters who are, even if they're not invulnerable or invincible, are almost, like Squirrel Girl, unbeatable. And eventually they win. You never read one of these stories or watch one of these TV shows, and at the end the hero's lying in a pool of blood in a back alley saying, well, that guy was too big for me. I bit off more than I could chew. He always wins, even if he wins by the skin of his teeth. Right. Everybody loves that.
So a question came in I'll ask because it came in about the Shadow. So what do you think about the choice of James Patterson to write the new Shadow novels?
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea to have a well-known best-selling writer attempt to revive this character and modernize him for the 21st century. We live in a world of electronic surveillance and cameras everywhere. The old 1930s Shadow would have a hard time in today's world unless he upped his game. So I'm hoping James Patterson brings the Shadow into the 21st century with appropriate abilities and appropriate skills, yet retains the essence of what Walter Gibson created.
Right. So you've written and edited across various mediums: novels, short stories, magazines, nonfiction, comic books. Do you prefer one medium to the other?
I like novels because you can tell a bigger, richer, more epic story. But working in comics was fun. I did Doc Savage on radio. We did 13 episodes of the Adventures of Doc Savage for NPR. I did 6 of them, adapting. That was fun. I like short stories. I've been writing Sherlock Holmes stories like crazy for the last 3 years. Everything I've tried to undertake, I've done reasonably well at, enjoyed. But I guess novels are the most fun because it's just you and the character, and it's your byline. Right. Even though anthologies are great, it's great to sit down and write a short story for an anthology and say, okay, I'm done. Right.
So let me ask you, so you do a lot of, the pulp, the action adventure, but you've also ventured into horror a little bit with some work with Lovecraft and Cthulhu. What's the appeal? I'm not a horror guy, but what's the appeal for you? What's the appeal of the horror side?
Well, Lovecraft was a unique voice, a unique vision. He saw the universe as a haunted house, and he didn't write ghost stories. He didn't write werewolf stories or vampire stories. He wrote stories of things from other dimensions, things from deep, dark, interstellar space that were inimical to the man. And he just brought such a different worldview or universe view to horror. And again, he was a pulp writer. I love the pulp writers, and even though they don't write the same, they have this same sort of compressed ability to tell a story in a shorter span than maybe modern writers do. Right. And Lovecraft's just a fascinating writer.
So, all right. So we've talked about a whole bunch of stuff that you had done. So you've got some Sherlock Holmes stuff coming up. What's going on? Tell me
We
about Sherlock
just
Holmes.
released The Wild Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is a collection of 10 of my Sherlock Holmes short stories that have previously appeared in anthologies. If it sells well, we'll do another 10 next year. If we look at my virtual background, my most recent novel is Tarzan, Conqueror of Mars, a project we've dreamed of reading for 100 years, when Tarzan meets John Carter of Mars, and no one's been able to quite pull it off in a way that's been satisfactory to either the Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated people or to fans. And I got permission to do a simple story. There have been more complicated versions of this story, but a simple story with no other characters. And Tarzan has a misadventure and ends up on Mars and has to find his way home. And it's a hard journey. You just can't walk there.
Wait, so we got a guy who, so you're telling me that, a character who fundamentally was stranded from, cut off from civilization, had to learn how to survive in the wild, is now once again stranded, but now on Mars.
Where there's hardly any trees, the gorillas are 12 feet tall and have extra limbs and don't speak his language.
Well, you have there's no sympathy for Tarzan, huh?
No, I had to basically kill him off and resurrect him to get him into this story. And I gave him the biggest challenge of his career, how to get home. He doesn't even know where he is in the beginning.
Oh, well, he's from one jungle to another, I guess. So go back to Sherlock Holmes a little bit, because we jumped a little past that. So you've got 10 short stories. So Sherlock Holmes unto himself is, it's obviously an iconic character, but they're fun. They're all mysteries.
Yeah.
So what is it about? I mean, is a mystery element really? I mean, even to the Shadow and to Batman and that kind of thing. They're detectives in their own way. Is that a theme? So as a writer and as a reader, is that something thematically that appeals to you? That's sort of the mystery element of the story?
Well, in my other novels, my Dark Savages primarily, and maybe in my stories a little, there'd be some mystery elements. Who the villain is sometimes the mystery, or what they're doing, or what their goal is. This was an opportunity to tell real mysteries, mysteries that were the central to the story. Since I'm more of an adventure and a science fiction fantasy writer, Sherlock Holmes was a real challenge in a good sense, right, because I had to come up with period pieces and crimes that were unique, compelling, plausible, and you could accept Sherlock Holmes tackling them. You would not accept Sherlock Holmes tackling the Joker, for instance. He needs an opponent that's scaled to his size and is appropriate to him.
Moriarty is essentially his nemesis.
His nemesis, yeah. But he doesn't have supervillains.
Right.
He doesn't necessarily deal with super menaces. He has to deal with Victorian crimes, murders, kidnappings. Some of my stories are a little out there, but usually with a plausible explanation. And Sherlock Holmes, I have a gift for writing in the style of the originating writer, whether it's Dark Savage, Tarzan, The Shadow, The Spider, which is one of my new undertakings. And Sherlock Holmes, I can get in and channel the writer and make a credible effort to make you feel like you're reading an original story written way back then. That's why I get to do all these characters, because I can fake it till I make it.
Fair enough. All right. So that was great. So now it's the time for the special section of the show, which we do every week, which is Spin the Wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories, some of which I have hand selected just for you. We're going to spin the wheel, and what you get is what you play. And the categories are Me, Tarzan, You, Jane, Space Meal, Stranger in a Strange Land, Pulp Kitchen, The Shadow Knows, Spend That Money, and Fear of Flying. All right, you ready? I'm going to spin the wheel, and here we go. You ready? And what did you get? You got Spend That Money. Okay. So you have come into possession of $1 million gifted tax-free from one of Doc Savage's heists. He's collected the funds. You can't save it. You can't invest it. You have to spend it. Spend that money.
Well, you know, I think in the middle of a pandemic, I would put that money into healthcare or feeding people.
Oh, fair enough. Anything for yourself?
No,
Okay. Well, you're a generous soul then. Fair enough. All right, Will. So you and I are both in the writing business. So let's go to our advice column. So what's the best and worst writing advice? And we'll apply this. It may doesn't have to apply to pulp exactly, but what's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you or advice you overheard?
well, I remember when I was getting to the place where I was trying to break into the field. I remember writing a outline for a Nick Carter novel back in the Nick Carter Killmaster uh, phase, and it got rejected. But with we want to keep you in mind because you have good ideas, but it never developing. But someone I knew said, you know, you were born too late for the pulp era and too late for the action adventure era because the day of the execution of the story, although it was still strong, they had dominated the field. And he said, you know, you kind of missed the boat because it's hard to get a career going in the field you want to be in. But it turned out not to be true because I wrote the story and I wrote Doc Savage. Just we didn't see that coming.
So you thought
So in other words, I was being discouraged from pursuing my dream.
You're rejecting the notion of listening to people who discourage you.
Yeah. Well, I'm also rejecting the, you know, advice that comes out of left field. You know, just because someone spots the trend doesn't mean the trend is over or ending. It could mean the trend is just going to coast for about 20 years. Full-time radio lasted a long time and then it was over.
All right, so I'm going to take some questions from the folks at home. So a question just came in for you, Will. So what message, positive or otherwise, can we draw from the pulps and their modern incarnations about life today versus life when the pulps ascended?
I don't know that there's a message since they're entertainment. I try not to put messages in my books. If you get a message out of my book, that's you reading into it. I mean, I don't write message books. I write entertainments.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So one thing we didn't cover, Will, you had mentioned that you're writing The Spider. Tell us about The Spider a little bit.
The Spider. The Spider is the first mentally ill superhero. He was created in the 1930s by a writer who seemed to have some mental health issues because he created a character who was a manic depressive, had a messiah complex, was almost a paranoid schizophrenic. Millionaire Richard Wentworth becomes a spider, a sort of a supercharged version of the Shadow. He was completely ruthless, killed criminals by the scores, and fought menaces even worse than Doc Savage and the Shadow combined. And I got the license to do the character about 3 years ago. And 2 years ago, I put out the first Spider novel of mine, The Doom Legion, which guest starred Operator 5, another character I licensed, as well as G8 and his Flying Aces, although we left them out. And now I'm working on my second Spider, Fury and Steel, which is a sequel to Doom Legion. And then I'll do Scourge of the Scorpion, where the Spider battles the Scorpion, who had his own magazine at the same time the Spider did, although that one only lasted one issue. I love the Spider because the writing is more adult. The characters are more fully realized. But he's an insane character. He's absolutely insane character. He just thinks he's God's avenger. I think compared to Doc Savage and the Shadow, who were really well grounded emotionally, intellectually, the Spider takes us into some really crazy places.
So one of the comments comes in. So someone once said that the Shadow laughed to strike fear into the heart of evildoers. Does the Spider laugh because he really likes his work?
I think that may be part of it. The Spider's laugh is more like I'm going to kill you laugh, whereas the Shadow's laugh is you run away or I'll shoot you. You know, I think that's the difference. And the Spider liked to leave the mark of the Spider on the foreheads of the criminals he killed, whereas the Shadow didn't fool with stuff like that.
So another question came in. Do you think that you'll be involved in bringing the Spider into the modern age?
I don't know. The Spider has recently been bought by Don Murphy of Angry Films Incorporated. He of Natural Born Killers and the Transformers films. he's purchased the Spider as well as Operator 5 and some of the other characters in the hopes that they can be brought into media. Whether I'd be involved or not, I don't know. All I know is Don has said, go ahead with your books, keep writing them, and we'll see where things go. But I think the Spider would be a great TV or movie character because he's, again, much more fully realized than most pulp characters in terms of the fact he's a living, breathing person with problems and issues and torments, and as well as great heroics. But also, Stan Lee read the Spider growing up, and you can see it in his writing. You can see it in Spider-Man, even though Spider-Man's a very different character.
Right.
So I'm very proud to do the Spider.
So one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. So it's a little bit of a follow-up. So your pulp books, are they set in the present, or are they all in their original?
They're all the original time period.
Okay. All right. So I think that's what we got from the folks at home. So Will, we got another minute or two. So it's been a great half hour. Before we wrap up, it's time for Shameless Promotion. We've talked about a bunch of new books coming out. Where can folks get them, and what are you most excited about?
Well, all my books are on Amazon and Nook as soft covers and ebooks. My hardcovers and my soft covers and my ebook can be downloaded from my own website, www.adventuresinbronze.com. Adventures in Bronze is all one word, lowercase. You can go there and shop around. That's where you can get my Tarzan books, my Tarzan King Kong book, my Doc Savage Meet the Shadow books, my Doc Savage books, my Spider books, now my Sherlock Holmes book.
All right.
And who knows what I'm going to do next.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Will, for a great show. And I want to thank everyone who's watching. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. And if you want to jump into some more pulp stories that you may not have read, including a previously unpublished story by Doc Savage creator himself, Lester Dent, I'll encourage you to pick up Thrilling Adventure Yarns, which includes a story by Will Murray and one by me, The Legend of Hammerjack Curry. And so Thrilling Adventure Yarns is available for sale now through Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And the sequel is due out next year. And while I'm here, because I need to do it before we leave up for the summer. So my newest book, my sci-fi intergalactic Private Eye, Angela Hardwick, has her first novel, Crackle and Fire. She gets involved into some galactic shenanigans, think a little bit mixed of Doctor Who and Blade Runner, all turned into one Private Eye. This will be out officially in print in September 1st, and it's already available for ebook pre-order right now. So I want to thank everyone who's been watching. This has really been a great summer for me. I'm going to be taking a break for about a month, and I'll be back starting September 16th for an entire season of great new interviews. And I want to thank everyone who stuck with it throughout the summer. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you, Will. Thanks everyone at home. And I'll talk to everyone in about a month. Take care now.